we're going to move on into Genesis 12 now, and we're at verse 10. And I'm going to just read this whole story, Minister Joe, and then we'll just talk about it. Sure, because it's a very interesting story. It's the first thing Abraham does in the land we talked about last week. He takes a little tour of the land. He starts in the north. He travels all the way to the south. He builds a couple of altars, calls on the name of the Lord, and settles in the southern part of modern-day Israel in a region called the Negev, which is somewhat arid. I mean, it's not like a desert, but it's dry. They depend on wells to live there. Wells are fought over. Mm-hmm. And Abraham's going to dig some wells, and a man named Abimelech actually owns some wells in that region. And wells that's big-time property. So that's where he settles. But like we said last week, he doesn't stay there very long before there's a famine. And of course, when there's a famine, the first place to be affected is the places that don't have a lot of resources to begin with. And that just so happens to be where he's settled. He's in the Negev, and it's not heavily resourced. So the famine pinches there quick. Yeah. And that's where we are. So I'm going to read this, and then we're going to interact and talk about it. So don't be too hard on Abram. This is like really early on in his following God. He's barely made it in. He's living very much like a Sumerian. He's living like his culture. So not a lot of changes have occurred in him. He's only had one conversation with God to this point, at least any extended conversation. And it didn't give him a lot of ethical instruction. Just told him to leave and to follow. So here we are. This is verse 10 of chapter 12. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they'll let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife, or Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and be gone. And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they set him on his way with his wife and all that he had. So it's an interesting story. Sure, especially we're meant to remember that Sarah is in her 70s at this point.
Yeah, she really held her beauty well, huh?
Yeah.
The eye of beauty was different then, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. No, I don't. Yeah, she's near Abraham's age. It's possible he's a little older, but I think we'll find out later in the story that they're very close to the same age.
Well, he was 75 when he left.
He was 75, and I'm trying to think. When he was 99, I think, when Isaac ends up being born, and I think she's in her 90s. But she may not be the same age as him. She may be a little younger, but not enough,
right?
To make this seem like it's sensible. But it was sensible to Abram. So right. We'll start at the beginning. So we talked about the famine, and then he goes to Egypt. I'll say this, and then let you interact with the narrative itself. Mm-hmm. Egypt is the most likely place you would go, because when there is a drought or a famine, the Egyptians were pretty well positioned because the water they lived off of was the Nile River. And that was sourced much further south in Ethiopia, modern-day Ethiopia. They knew it as Cush. And the river was pretty, it was something you could depend on. Because of the region was fairly well watered, even if Egypt was dry, that river kept running. They lived off of that river. And so that's where people would go in this world. If you lived where Abram did in the Negev, Egypt is your only option. And in these days, there weren't quite the border issues that there are now. As long as you didn't cause trouble and you had no difficulty serving under Pharaoh, people would travel where they could to get food all the time. Like you'll notice in the story of Ruth, Naomi's family leaves Israel and goes to Moab during a time of famine because Moab was known to have food and water. So these things happened a lot. And it's just important to recognize that. So Abram going to Egypt, there's nothing immoral about him doing this. This is a very natural thing for him to do. It will later be considered immoral for the Israelites to go back to Egypt after they've been delivered. But we probably shouldn't read that in here. It's a very natural thing to do. So I wanted to begin with that, a little bit of history. But Minister Joe, how do you enter into this story? What are the first things you think need to be stated as we dive deep?
Well, we talked a little bit about last time about how coming into the land, Abram was obedient. He built the altars, and sometimes in ministry or in life, especially after you make a commitment to follow the Lord, there's going to be a time of testing or a time where it could be difficult. So I see him in a situation that I think sets the stage for lots of things down the road when we talk about even like almost foreshadowing the situations where we're talking about with Jacob and Joseph and some other people, but also the realization that the way I think, and we know also too, or maybe it's not been stated, that Job is a very old book, probably one of the earlier books that was established.
Yeah, Job is an old story.
So the concept that because we know that in the beginning of this chapter, God says to Abram that I'm going to make you a great nation, and I'm going to bless those who bless you and those who curse you. And so I think this is setting the stage for a pretty good example of how that really works out, how it plays out in reality, because we see Abram going to a place of refuge for him, and yet he's scared that his wife is going to be taken from him, or more like he's more afraid that he'll be put to death because of her beauty. And you said earlier that she's quite old, or old in our standards, or even then, and we know, well, maybe we don't know, but I assume that Egyptian beauty is a little bit different than maybe this, you call them the Sumerians type of beauty. So this is the question I have, is like,
yeah,
how in the world would they find him attractive? Like sometimes
the interesting thing is that Abram anticipates that this will happen. He is well aware that the Egyptians will find Sarah attractive, and he's right, which probably tells us Abram has some knowledge of Egypt. I mean, it doesn't have to say that. Maybe he just was very attracted to his wife and figured everybody else would be. Yeah. But I'm guessing he probably has some knowledge of Egypt. He certainly knows to go there. With the famine, there's not a lot of deliberation. He knows exactly where to go, even though he's a foreigner. Yeah. And we could say, well, maybe he talked to local people and they told him this, but being Sumerian, I'm guessing he knew of this empire. I'm guessing he knew a bit about it. So anyway, very, very interesting beginning. And just because of our conversation, I did look up in Hebrew the name Sarai, and that is, I'm sure my new Hebrew instructor would tell me that I'm wrong about it, but as I read the Hebrew, Sarai sounds right.
Sarah, yeah. I think maybe what I might be carrying that over from is from the actual experience with Joseph when his brothers come to visit him in Egypt, and how they say that there's a statement said that Hebrews are detestable.
Right. Now, yeah, and there is, by then they are firmly living in Canaan. So they're thoroughly Canaanite, and the issue there is that they are shepherds. Yeah. And shepherds are disdainful to the Egyptians at that time. But here we're talking century later.
Yeah, it's probably the carryover that I'm projecting.
Yeah, and Abram is also a shepherd.
Mhm.
Like he has flocks and herds, but apparently in Egypt at that time, it's not the same stigma. You know, things change. Because really between Abram and Joseph, I mean, you have a long period of time there.
Mhm.
You know, it's at least a century.
But the text also shows us too that he grows in wealth because of this situation. And
Yeah.
they're all
Do
animals.
you think there's a chance that the reason by the time of Joseph the Egyptians don't like shepherds is because of Abraham? You never know how these stories go.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing because it's like you would think that they would need those to keep their economy going well. I mean, you need sheep and oxen and donkeys, and you know it says that he did very well. It said because of her, and yet in the next verse it says great plagues happened in the house of Pharaoh.
Pharaoh, yeah, unstated plagues. At this point, we don't know what they were, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there were a lot of animal husbandry in Egypt. I can only assume that, but a lot of my research in Egypt, it was definitely an economy that depended a great deal on agriculture, maybe certainly more so than the Negev, where Abram was. It was more of an agricultural area, and you find this same thing in Israel around waterways. Like in Galilee, there's a little more agriculture than in the Negev. So they might not have depended quite as much on animal husbandry as Abram would have had to.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a lot harder getting water out of a well than a river.
Yeah, I think so. The Nile is so productive that they could dig trenches off of it and water great vast areas of farmland when the river was flowing well.
Yeah.
So, and of course, that rich silt that came with the river too was also great at fertilizing the soil. I mean, the Egyptians they settled on the Nile for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
and just for trivia's sake, the Nile runs north, right?
It runs north.
Which is,
yeah, its source waters are in the south, but it still runs downhill.
Yeah.
I know it's hard, right, to imagine. Yeah, the Mississippi runs more normally, right, north to south. That feels right.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So, but the Nile is a very important river. I mean, still is today.
Right.
Still is today. I mean, it was a god in ancient Egypt. They worshipped it.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that Moses turned it to blood, because God was confronting the Nile as a god. And he attacks their two best gods first and last. You know, first the river, then the sun. At the end, you know, those are their two primary gods.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So I don't know how to answer this. I think it's pretty common in the ancient Near East. I can't say this far back, for kings, pharaohs, whoever's in charge to take whoever they want as a wife. We certainly see it in David later when he does this with Bathsheba and conspires to have Uriah killed. Is it funny? Well, funny, not funny, haha, but interesting that Abram fears Pharaoh will use his power precisely the way one of Abram's descendants eventually uses his.
Yeah, let alone Solomon. I mean, what, 700 wives?
Yeah, we don't have a story of Solomon killing anybody's husband for those wives, but we do have David doing that twice.
Quite a bit of negotiation for
So here's my trivia. That happens to David twice. Do you remember the first time? I don't want to put you on the spot.
When he killed somebody twice?
He didn't kill him. God killed him, but he took his wife right afterwards. And it was the man named Nabal.
Nabal.
Yeah, Nabal. David's fleeing from King Saul, and he ends up settling on Mount Carmel, just south of Carmel, and he's protecting the flocks of a man named Nabal. And eventually they want some food, so they ask for it, and Nabal says, I'm not giving you any food. So David gets mad, and he's going to go kill Nabal. And his wife Abigail stops the procession and says, hey, my husband's a fool. That's what his name is. And please don't slaughter the whole house because of him. And David thanks her for stopping him, and then God kills Nabal, or Nabal dies of terror. And then David goes and calls for Abigail and takes her. So he takes two widows into his house, but he almost killed the first one's husband. He does kill the second one. But anyway, Abram's worried about that. I'm guessing this is something kings did.
Yeah. Huh. Trophy wives, I guess, huh?
Yeah, or just, kings can covet. It's so interesting. And you had mentioned, Minister Joe, the 10 Commandments when we were doing earlier studies, like at Babel and the flood and all that. It's very interesting how a lot of Abram's instincts get made illegal in the law of Moses. Like Abram, we'll find out later, has married his half-sister. That's outlawed in the law of Moses. Abram and his children eventually have multiple wives. Hagar, a story that's coming up with Abram, that gets outlawed later, that you can't marry sisters. So there's quite a number of things. And certainly this behavior he's afraid of,
right,
is outlawed. So it's an interesting beginning for Abram. So what do you think about this? Tell them you are my sister. How does it make you feel about Abram?
Well, as a man, I think I would have a hard time telling my wife that. But they seem to have a different relationship, don't they?
Well, there's no doubt that marriage itself is different in these days than what we would think of as a healthy marriage.
I mean, later on in Hebrews, it commends her as being making her Abram is her master, calls her master.
Yeah, that she submits to him. There is, and especially in these days, that would have been expected in the culture. So more or less, Hebrews is saying that Sarai was a woman without question in terms of her integrity in her day.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether or not that same behavior would have been expected in the first century Roman Empire is another question, but there's no doubt that you're going to praise somebody for living up to the ethical requirements of their society.
Yeah.
Now, I know it's common today for us to judge previous societies by our own ethical values, and I'm not saying that that's not appropriate. How do you learn unless you go back and ask yourself, what would we have done differently? What was done wrong? But still, you have to praise people who live according to the best ethical sense they are given in their day.
Mm-hmm.
And Sarai gets that praise. My sense of Abram here is he's protecting his own life. And you can understand in the culture that if Abram died, if Sarai is taken by Pharaoh, or if she dies, the family goes on. But if Abram dies in this culture, that's the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's trying to protect himself. It seems to me to be an instinct you would expect. He might even think he's doing God's will, because God's the one who told him he's going to bring a great nation from him. He hasn't had any children yet.
Right.
So he probably thinks, I need to survive.
Yeah. Or he really believes, like some people might say, that he's got the faith. He's believing that God's going to bless him, and those who curse him are going to. So maybe he's anticipating this kind of behavior.
Yeah, maybe he's expecting God to fight his battles for him. That'd be a very generous reading. I suspect not.
Yeah.
But that's because I suspect not. Like, who could say? I guess in the new heavens and the new earth, Abram will have to speak for himself.
Yeah, we'll want to hear that story sometime. But
yeah, so he gives Sarah, whose name is Sarai at this point, it hasn't been changed. And if you notice me jumping back and forth between Abraham and Abram and Sarai and Sarah, that change to Abram's name comes way later in the story, but he's Abraham to me.
Right.
The name Abram means exalted father, is what it means. Av means father. A-B. It's pronounced as a V if it's at the end of a word. So Av means father, and Ram means exalted or lifted up one. So his name means exalted father. Later, we're told that his name is changed to mean father of many, which my Hebrew instructor tells me is not what Abraham actually means. He sort of laughed. He says, it's funny that the Bible tells us it's supposed to mean father of many. Funny enough, it doesn't. But he didn't tell me what it did mean. Stay tuned, and when I have my next session with him, he'll tell me what the name really means. But anyway, so if I go back and forth with those names, don't worry about it. So Sarai is taken into Pharaoh's house, just as Abram feared. And what is the occasion? I don't know if this is important, but how does Pharaoh hear of? I mean, does he just see her?
No, actually, it says in the text that his servants, as officials, I think it says, in the translation we just read, his officials notice her and say, "Hey, this is a good-looking woman. She's beautiful. You ought to take her as your wife,
Yeah,
or
it's
into your home."
strange.
Into your home, I think. I don't know if it doesn't say as your wife.
She's not going to be a wife of the way that we would understand wife, like an inheritor or somebody who could give birth to a pharaoh. She's probably going to be more like a concubine. That would be my guess. My translation says taken into Pharaoh's house, and I think that's pretty literal.
Mm.
Yeah, but some translations may say take her as your wife, meaning that he was intending to be intimate with her, which is probably true. But we understand in the ancient world there is a different status between wives and concubines. I'm not justifying it, just the way it was.
Right.
Yeah. And so he takes her because his officials praise her to him. It's very interesting how this happens.
Right.
You know, I don't know if we want to really dive deep into that because I don't know enough about the culture. I don't think anybody does to know if this was a normal thing. I just find it interesting that he was almost goaded into taking her into his house, almost like the king has to have the best of everything.
Right. Yeah, it's a peculiar thing to say. I mean, especially the officials. You can see if somebody were like there's, how in the world do the officials see her? That's the real question.
Yeah, and I want to say this. I think it's important. Oftentimes kings in the scriptures are meant to show the nature of a culture. So I think this still remains true with leaders. Honestly, I think oftentimes they are manifestations of the culture out of which they arise. And I know it's pretty common in the Bible to talk about the whole country going in the direction of the king, especially when you have a monarchical situation where people are inheriting. But I still think that the king is meant to be a summary statement of the people that king or queen leads. And so even though he's seeing Pharaoh here, I think that they're telling us something about the Egyptians. And it's not foreign to Abram. Abram also has the same inclination that people want what they find attractive.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a general covetousness that Abram expects to find in Egypt, and I would imagine it takes one to know one, probably because it existed in Sumeria, probably exists in him as well. And he anticipates it and he finds it. So I think in some ways we are seeing in Pharaoh's behavior and that of his officials something that's supposed to inform us about the very nature of the people of Egypt, but also about Abram, because Abram knew. I don't know if you've ever lived by this, Minister Joe, but I remember when I was a young kid, I listened to a sermon that was uncomfortable for me because of the subject material. And I said to my dad, "Is that true?" And my father said to me, "People tend to condemn what they themselves struggle with." And I remembered thinking, so what you're telling me is that preacher was revealing more about his own struggles than about the nature of truth. My dad said, "Yeah, I think about that every time I write a sermon." It's something that has carried with me. And I suspect that Abram's awareness this would happen tells us as much about Abram and where he starts with God as it does about Pharaoh in Egypt. But this seems to be in the culture, a general covetousness that the king can indulge because there's no one to stop him, but probably exists all the way down through. It's just inhibited by culture, maybe for most people.
I mean, if this were written in a time of today, this would be a con game.
Yeah.
Where you send the wife inside the house to see what kind of goods there are.
Right.
And then make off in the middle of the night,
Yeah, they're knowing that this tendency exists can be exploited for personal gain. As a matter of fact, it is probably regularly in our own culture, people playing this game all the time, knowing that people are very susceptible to this. And funny enough, it just tells us that as the Egyptians were and as Abram was in Samaria, so we still are. Like, some things just never change. We're still easily manipulated by things we find attractive.
So any of the commentaries or anything that you've read, has anyone said it's a test to see if God was going to do what he promised in the blessing and cursing?
I've not come across that reading, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm certainly not read exhaustively Genesis. I think I probably spent the most time with Gordon Wenham, and I think he's more apt to read this as a character flaw on Abram's part. I think it's pretty easy from our perspective to condemn this behavior. So I think I've never thought before about your reading, and it could be right, because I can think of a dozen reasons why it wouldn't naturally occur to me, because I want to condemn Abraham here. I have, but you're right. He may be putting his faith to the test. But if he really wanted to test it, don't you think he would have just not said she was his sister and just taken his lumps and trusted God to protect him?
Yeah, that's one end of the stick, right? The other end of it is this is a big leap. Yeah. I wouldn't just give my wife up. Just that's what's so strange to us about Lot and his daughters, or that's down the road too. But
yeah,
this idea of,
the commentaries I've read indicate that this is something that people who lived under the jurisdiction of kings were familiar with this behavior in these days. And I think you could probably say that this, whenever you live under a king who has somewhat unchecked authority, you're always at risk of this. Like I movies are movies. They're not always based in history, but pretty much every king is depicted as this sort of a lush. I can think of a few movies off the top of my head.
Yeah.
That the whole thing is based on a king that wants to abuse the people. So I'm guessing that Abram has not done anything unusual here. But it's possible it was unusual.
It is very, very interesting, though, at the end of the passage we read, like where it talks about Pharaoh, and Pharaoh talking to Abram and saying to him, "Why didn't you tell me this was your wife?" There's actually no rebuttal or any excuse or anything given other than, get your wife and get out of here kind of thing. And Abram doesn't say anything.
Yeah, and we were talking about this before we started recording, but this is a feature of how the Hebrew people tell stories. And oftentimes, if you have a story like this where there's so many questions you have and none of them are addressed, wait for it. This story is going to be repeated and the answers to your questions are going to be given. And that's a way that the Hebrew people tell stories, at least in the scripture. I'm not talking about people today. But the scriptural stories are written in this way. There's a lot of repetition. And they're oftentimes, if the repetition is sophisticated enough, it's called a chiasm. And that's a feature. You could Google it. Any of our people could Google what a chiasm is. But what it looks like, I often call it a narrative hill. So you tell a story. Well, I should do it this way because of the mirror image. But you tell a story, you move your way up a hill, very typical story like we would tell. You have a setting, characters, a developing plot, some sort of a crisis. It kind of follows that arc to a degree. But then you hit this point, and then you start going down the other side, and you start paralleling the steps it took to get up there, but in the opposite order. So oftentimes at the end, it looks like you've got parallel stories, parallel stories, parallel stories, parallel stories, parallel stories, and then one story that doesn't have a duplicate that sits at the center of that chiasm. Now, you can see this in the Gospel of Luke. That's why there's a feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. You might say, why did you repeat that story? Well, one is on one side of the hill. The other is on the other side of the hill. And the same thing is going to happen with this story. So when you know that the Hebrew people write this way, what you have to pay attention to is the central story, because that story is going to be used to interpret all the rest. So basically what happens is you walk along this road and you hit this point where something significant happens, and then you have to watch how that changes the journey down the hill. It's a very interesting, it's a pretty good memory device. We were talking about that. If you have to pass this on orally, telling the same story, two different stories in very similar ways makes it easier to remember. So, but you have to notice the differences, because that is the point. So we're going to move on now from this opening story of Abram and Pharaoh to the parallel story of Abraham, I think at that point, I think so, and Abimelech.
Right.
So let's move on to that. And now that we've read this first one, what I want you to notice, and Minister Joe is going to be taking note of this as well, is where there are differences. So you ready for this?
Sure. Something I didn't tell you either is that my half-brother's name is Abram.
Oh. Is he an exalted father?
He's not married, doesn't have any kids either. So
Interesting.
Maybe it's going to come along. I think he has a girlfriend named Sarah, though. That's kidding. I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, Abram is not as common a name as Abraham, obviously, nowadays. But so this is Genesis 20, verse 1. And it's a parallel story to the Egyptian one. So notice the differences. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the region of the Negev. So he's back here. And you have to study the story of Abraham to watch his travels. He doesn't stay in this region all the time. And settled between Kadesh and Shur. Kadesh, you'll remember later, will be it's an oasis in the Negev. And that's where I'm pretty sure it's the same Kadesh Barnea, where the spies are sent in to spy out the land much later in the book of Exodus. But anyway, he settles between Kadesh and Shur. While residing in Gerar as an alien, Abraham said of his wife Sarah, see, their names have changed by now, she is my sister. And King Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah. So now he's in the region of another king, much smaller king, not as big as Pharaoh. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, you're about to die because of the woman whom you've taken, for she's a married woman. Now Abimelech had not approached her, meaning he hadn't been intimate yet. So he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother? I did this in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. Furthermore, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all that are yours. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things, and the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you brought such great guilt on me and my kingdom? You've done things to me that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what were you thinking? What were you thinking of, that you did this thing? Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do to me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah to him. Abimelech said, my land is before you, settle where it pleases you. To Sarah he said, look, I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It's your exoneration before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So let's spend the rest of our time, Minister Joe, talking about the additional details we did not know the first time this story was told.
Oh, yeah. There's lots of things.
Tons. Yeah.
The first thing is, one of the things that's still similar is it says he was still an alien.
Yeah.
And so came as pretty much as a foreigner. I would think that's the real deal. But,
yeah, he's an alien. The word in Hebrew is the word gur, which means a sojourner, alien. So he's been promised this land, but this word being used of him indicates that he's still, it's not his home.
Right. He's different looking,
Yeah.
different everything.
Yeah. And Abimelech is a king ruling in the region of the Negev, probably a local chief of some sort in this area, nothing like Pharaoh, but still he's in charge.
Right. And we talked about earlier, I think once, that the name Abimelech is more of a title.
Yeah, and so you'll see it later in the story of Isaac, the king in the same region by the same name. But the word Abimelech in Hebrew, again, Av, it has the same beginning of his name as Abraham does. Means father. E means my. Melech means king. So this means my father is king. So it's probably a title, which is why it gets passed down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. The interesting thing, again, is that he's an alien. He makes a pact with his wife, and it's been pre-established. But we see Abimelech wants to take her in as his wife into the house, and I think one of the first things that comes up is that we see an actual relationship between God and Abimelech actually being talked about here.
Yeah.
That is so that you don't see it all happening in Pharaoh.
Right.
But the discussion is by result of, or Pharaoh says, this is happening to me. He interprets it.
Pharaoh, you get the impression that God spoke to Pharaoh. Like it kind of implies that, if not says it directly, but you have no idea the content.
Right.
But it's more implied with Pharaoh. He is aware of the situation. We don't know that much how.
Mm-hmm.
But with Abimelech, it's pretty clear. God speaks to him directly. And for this, I want to give a little encouragement on how to read these names. So you already know this, Minister Joe, I know. But for any of our listeners, whenever you see G-O-D in the scriptures, that is the Hebrew name Elohim. Sometimes it's El, which is the shortened form of Elohim. Elohim is plural, because in Hebrew, to make something great, you make it plural. So that happens a lot. The full name of God is El Elohim, God of gods. But it's often shortened just to Elohim. You'll notice this, like we grew up saying Holy of Holies, right? Because that's actually what the Hebrew says. You make it plural to make it great. King of kings, Lord of lords, God of gods, Holy of holies. This is a Hebrew feature. So God's name is plural, not because of the Trinity, though the Trinity is developed later, but because of a feature of Hebrew. So oftentimes we're talking about our God, it's going to be plural because the plural name indicates greatness, sometimes called the plural of majesty. But whenever you see G-O-D, that's either the name El, the short form, or Elohim, the plural form, singular or plural. It's one or the other. So when the translators put a little g, it's actually the same word in Hebrew. There's no capital letters in Hebrew. They're all capital letters. Mm-hmm. So it's just a translator's choice on whether they want to put a little g because we're not talking about the God of Israel, or a capital G because we are talking about the God of Israel. But it's the same word in either case every time. Now, the unique name of God, we actually don't see here until chapter 21. And sorry, I didn't mean to put that up, but I did want to highlight it. So this name, if you see this when you're reading your Bible, and this is consistent in most translations, NIV, New Revised Standard Version, New American Standard Bible, all do this. I'm pretty sure the English Standard Version does it. I'm reading that now, and I'm pretty sure it does it. But anytime you see the capital L with small capital letters O-R-D, that's the divine name. That's the unique name of the God of Israel, the name that we often say Yahweh. Some people mistakenly say Jehovah, an ancient mistake that hasn't been remedied. But we think maybe Yahweh. At the very least, his name is YHWH. We're not 100% sure on the vowels that go with it. But Yahweh, anytime you see capital L, small capital letters, O-R-D, it's always the name Yahweh. That's the unique God of Israel. If you ever see capital L, small letter O-R-D, and all of this only applies in the Old Testament, in the First Testament. It's very different in Greek. But if you see capital L, small O-R-D, that is the name Adonai, which means master or Lord. So what's interesting here, like we're said in verse 18, that it was the Lord, it was Yahweh who closed fast all the wombs. Abimelech is talking to Elohim. Why I spent all that time pointing that out is he doesn't know who this God is. That is the generic term for God. All he knows is that a God is speaking to him. Now, if he had said Yahweh, now fully aware, the name Yahweh isn't revealed to Israel until Exodus chapter 3. But you'll notice that it appears in Genesis. And you might ask, how could they call him Yahweh? They didn't even know that name. Well, it's been written back in by Moses or the later writers so that you know who's at stake. Whenever it is uniquely the God of Israel, it's going to be Yahweh. God is a generic name. So Abimelech knows a God is speaking to him, but he doesn't know which God. He knows he's the God of Abraham, but he doesn't know which God is Abraham's God. So we don't need a lot of theological understanding in Abimelech. He's being interacted with by a God. He knows that God is protecting Abraham. That's about all he knows. But yes, so I want to make sure that much is clear. When the divine name is used, now we know that we're specifying, which God. And we know this is Yahweh. But Abimelech doesn't know it. He just refers to him as Elohim, which is the generic for God.
Yeah, but both Pharaoh and Abimelech know that they associate the problem with Abram.
They know that this particular deity, and like in Egypt, they believed in multiple deities. So Pharaoh doesn't know the God of Abram necessarily, but he knows that it is a God. And in the ancient world, every city had its own God, and every culture had its own God. So Abimelech there would have been gods of his own culture. He knows that the God that's talking to him is not one of his.
Mm-hmm.
He knows it's one associated with Abram. But he doesn't know who that God is.
Yeah.
So I want to point that out, and hopefully that helps our people reading the Old Testament generally, that you can notice the names being used.
Yeah, and it's also important to point out that it's specific, very specific here to why he comes to him in a dream, which is an interesting thing, but also pretty clear. It's not like somebody just spoke it to him.
Yeah. So just to, I know I'm interrupting a lot, but just to add these layers while they're fresh and there, this is the way God speaks most of the time, through dreams and through visions. Sometimes they're called riddles. God is not plain spoken most of the time. In fact, when God does speak plainly, like to Abraham, to Moses, that's considered a rare thing when God speaks plainly. Most of the time, and you'll see this all the way up to the New Testament. You remember at Pentecost when Peter says that the prophecy of Joel is being fulfilled, and part of that prophecy is your old men will see visions, your young men will dream dreams, right? So even the prophetic pouring out of the Spirit leaves us in God speaking through visions and dreams. That is his normal way of speaking. And so he is coming to Abimelech not in any kind of a special way. That's what we're saying. I mean, it's special anytime God speaks, but he's not speaking to Abimelech in a special way. It's in a dream.
Right.
Now, if God speaks to you while you're awake and plainly, well, that's very unique. That's Moses.
Yeah.
That's Abraham. Most of the time we have to interpret what's being said because it's visions and dreams. So nothing special about Abimelech here. This is routine.
Yeah. Later on, we when Joseph interprets the dreams,
of
That's a little
Pharaoh.
different here. This text specifically tells him exactly what he's done. And
God speaks to him directly in a dream.
yes,
So it
yes,
is, maybe I overstated though. I think you're right to point that out. It is God sometimes, maybe more commonly, gives a dream that needs to be interpreted, like in the case of Pharaoh or Nebuchadnezzar or whatever. This is very plain. Abimelech doesn't have to wonder what this God wants. But my point is, though, coming to him in a dream is pretty routine.
yeah. It's pretty specific too. Pretty clear. You know what you've done is wrong. You're gonna die. Yeah, this man is a prophet. Now that is really important at this point to expose, because
It's the first use of prophet that I'm aware of in the scriptures.
I mean, to identify uh, Abram or Abraham as the as his personal prophet really points that out, and makes a distinction uh, that is, I think, is very vital. You know,
I think very important. It's a great thing for us all to recognize. As far as I know, that's the first use of the word prophet in the First Testament. I will double check that to be sure that that's true. But while we're talking, but calling Abraham a prophet, and again, prophecy in the Bible is a complicated endeavor.
mm-hmm.
We often think that prophets are those who foretell the future, but you'll notice Abram never does that. And because he never does that, it should clue us in that prophecy is way more complicated than just simply predicting things. I've said that prophets speak the word of God to their time. And that is what Abraham is called to do. He speaks the word of God to his time. And that's what makes him a prophet. He is a spokesperson for God. He interprets God's words for his time. And that is the essence of prophecy. It's its most basic definition. And so when I was in seminary, and in college for that matter, my professors would put it this way. They would say a very small percentage of prophecy is foretelling. The majority of prophecy is forthtelling, of telling the people what God wants them to know when he wants them to know it.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what Abraham is called to do. You notice he never predicts the future. Abraham doesn't. But he is a prophet. So important. Yeah. So I keep interrupting you, but I got to pick the fruit when it's low. You're throwing some great fruit.
Yeah.
But he's a prophet. And that changes, right? He basically saying he's a spokesman for me.
Right.
That's going to change Abimelech's relationship.
Right. Well, the other thing I think we really need to emphasize too is that I think God is setting the stage, or the scripture is setting the stage for what it means to be a prophet. Here,
I agree with you. And it's important that in this case, the prophet reveals God, prays for someone, and brings a blessing. It's not about predicting the future. The first use of this word involves no predictions.
But it also circles the covenant God had made with him, the blessing and the curses, the realization that what was done was wrong, and that even the intensity of what happened in Egypt compared to what happened here in chapter 20 is even more so. We see the remedy. We see it's linked to Abraham.
That's right. When Abram is honest, this is the first time in his story he gets to do something that he was called to do, which is he gets to bless someone who's been cursed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, he was the source of the curse, so we're looking for better from Abraham in the future. But here, as a prophet, he blesses somebody, which is what he was called to do.
Right.
So you're right, we're getting a sense of what it means to be a prophet, and we're realizing that Abraham's call implies a certain expectation of behavior on his part, which is defined by the word prophecy.
But it also says too, and this is maybe interpretive, I don't really know. It says earlier on in the chapter there, it says, yes, I know that you do this in the integrity of your heart. Furthermore, I was kept from sinning against me. In other words, there seems to be some kind of knowledge that there's a right and wrong in this behavior that Abimelech seems to be aware that
Yeah, even though we've not been given any law from
Mhm.
God that would say adultery, for instance, is wrong, it still indicates, even without law, that Abimelech could have sinned against God.
Mhm.
Now, the question is that because in Abimelech's culture adultery was wrong? It seems clearly it is, right? Because Abimelech, he doesn't say, what do you mean? I can have whoever I want.
Mhm.
Instead, he says, I didn't know, which implies that had he known, would have been different. So it's possible God is holding him to the standards of his own culture. It's possible. But it's also possible that you don't need a law to sin. Like, how do you read it? Which do you think of? I mean, maybe there's another reading. Those are the two that occur to me. What do you think is more likely?
I think that there is this aspect of it where the association with Abram himself and him being a believer or a follower of God, that there's a sense that this was wrong.
You think it's wrong just because it's Abram's wife, or do you think it's wrong with anyone's wife? What do you think God is saying? Well, we know what's wrong with anyone's wife later, so it's not a matter of that. But is Abimelech condemned for this behavior only because it's Abraham's wife? Or would he have been condemned if it was anyone's wife?
It almost feels like it is because of it, because it's Abraham's wife. I mean, in between these two chapters, there's a lot that happens. There's Hagar, there's Ishmael, there's
So here's my response to what you're suggesting. I think God intervenes because it's Abraham's wife.
Yeah.
So I agree with that. But Abimelech's response makes me believe that he believed it to be wrong no matter whose wife it was.
Yeah. It seems that way, but I feel like it's a special thing here. Not that it's okay. We're not making an act.
No, because later on in the law, God reveals that he's not okay with this behavior ever.
Yeah.
And with David, he makes it abundantly clear when David does virtually the same thing that God is not pleased.
Yeah, and there's really no way for us to really know what Abimelech's
culture was. Yeah, it's all speculative. I just would expect that if this was not a sin in his culture, that he would have said, like, I don't understand. There's nothing wrong with this. But that's not his response. His response is, I didn't know, which sounds like someone with his hand caught in the cookie jar.
Yeah, right. And then he also says, that the one comment, are you gonna slay my whole community or all of my people because of this?
Well, and that's my thing. Like, he would be responding based on his expectations of what somebody would do, which I think reveals his own cultural beliefs.
Yeah.
So in his culture, well, maybe he's seeing Abraham as some sort of a representative of this God, like a king. And what would happen to Abimelech if he took another king's wife? Well, maybe they would go to war, like what happened in the war between the Trojans and the Athenians, right?
Yeah, they stole Helen.
Yeah, they stole Helen. So maybe, but my point is, as you read these things, their responses are revealing their assumptions.
Yeah, it's definitely more graphic and more information than the contrast with Pharaoh.
Yeah, so we don't know how Pharaoh knew Sarai was Abraham's sister. I mean, was Abraham's wife. But this indicates why. So you might say, but can you read this story into the older one? Yes, you can. They are parallel stories. And it's important, if you're reading Genesis as a narrative, it's important to realize that the writer is deliberately delaying this information so that you do not have it with Pharaoh. And your question is, why? Well, We're not having that study. That study would require the entire story of Abraham to be laid out in front of us.
Yeah.
But these are deliberately withheld. So I would say, yes, the indication is that Pharaoh had a similar conversation. That's how he knew.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one detail that's different. The other detail, we're told in Pharaoh's case that curses come on the people,
Mm-hmm.
but we're not told what they are. Is it interesting to you what happened to Pharaoh's household, how he knew he was under a curse?
Mm-hmm.
Did you pick that up? His wife and his female slaves could bear no children.
Right.
How long would it take to know that that was happening? Years, right?
It could, or
You can't know in a month nobody's bearing children, can you?
unless they were already pregnant,
You mean unless all the kids were stillborn?
or they physically could not bear a child. Like say it was 9 months and it would not.
Yeah, I mean, I feel somewhat inadequate to say how long it would take to know you are barren, but I'm guessing it would take a long time to know you were barren. You know, Leah, for instance, later on will go a period of time without bearing any children. And then that's why she gives Jacob her maidservant, Bilhah.
Mm-hmm.
And then she'll start producing again. So how do they know? Is it just simply that for however long this is, nobody gets pregnant in Pharaoh's household? But how long would that have to happen before you were certain you were under a curse? I mean, it can't be 1 month, right?
Yeah, I guess unless you're really trying to become pregnant. I mean, this happens with infertility in our culture a lot.
But you're not considered infertile if you don't get pregnant in 3 months.
Yeah.
You know, it takes a long time. So right. I'm guessing that Sarah is in his house a long time. And the same was true with Pharaoh. I'm guessing these are much longer periods of time than we thought.
Yeah. The other thing too is we know that further down that Sarah is pretty much infertile, which is really interesting.
Isn't it interesting that she remains infertile during this period of lying? Because here is another detail. Did you catch it? Abram tells Abimelech he has done this everywhere. Mm. It's not just Pharaoh. It's not just Abimelech. Everywhere they went, they told this lie. How many houses was Sarah taken into? It's a blessing of God she was infertile. My goodness. You know, this is some of these details that are being revealed are dark, man.
Well, the other thing that's kind of strange is how could they not tell? I mean, you got a man, a woman, and a nephew. I mean, that's just the way you think about it.
Yeah.
Don't you think that's kind of a weird grouping?
Yeah, but you know, in this culture, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, typically they wouldn't have slept in the same tent. Typically they wouldn't have shown any public affection. You know, matter of fact, Isaac loves Rebekah way more affectionately than Abraham does Sarah, because the way that Isaac and Rebekah get found out later doing the same thing is that they've got some PDA going on.
Yes.
But that's not common. And Abraham and Sarah are old.
Yeah, right.
You know, Abram's in his 90s. Sarah is at least in her 70s, maybe closer to his age. Yeah. You know, so, you know, you don't see a lot of PDA in people that age anyway. So I think it wouldn't have been as hard to hide for Abraham and Sarah in that culture. Now, today, some men or women, for that matter, depending, can get in trouble for just not holding hands in public. You know, because people expect you should do something like that, but not in that culture. Very private. So the other detail that gets brought up, so I think I skipped it a bit, is that the only way for Abimelech to get healed is for Abraham to pray for him. Now, we don't see that detail in the story with Pharaoh either.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing that probably the same had to happen. And now let's remember the call. The call of Abram was that he would be blessed so that all nations on earth could be blessed through him.
Mm-hmm.
How's he doing?
He's striking out, it seems.
These two guys get cursed because of Abraham, and Abraham gets blessed. In both cases, they give Abraham stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But they don't get blessed.
Oh, they're blessed when he's gone.
Yeah.
Get out of here.
So, Abram is not living out his call. He is being blessed, but at the cost of other people. And that's not what God called him to do. So we are already aware that Abraham has a long way to go before he actually lives into the call of God. Now, I don't know if you want to dig into that anymore, but I think we want to be careful. Abraham is doing much better by this point in his life than he was at the beginning in terms of trusting God and living faithfully. He's learned some lessons, but he still is not fulfilling Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think that's the criteria we're given. We don't have a law to evaluate Abraham by. We don't have the 10 Commandments at this point where we can see if he's a good person by the law of Moses. But we do have God's call to him. And that, I continue, when I read the Abraham story, I insist on judging him only by that value system, that he is called to be a blessing to all nations on earth. And so I ask myself, is Abraham yet a good person by the standards God has given him to live by? And my answer at this point is not yet. That doesn't mean he's a bad person. He's a friend of God, but he still has not yet become the promise that God gave him.
Mm. He's still in the incubator.
Yeah. And many of our people may feel the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I think oftentimes we think of an instant world. Everything happens all at once, and forget about the process it takes. Some of this working out of our faith. Paul seems to talk about that as well.
Just because we're not yet measuring up doesn't mean we're not on the right road. Abraham is better. He continues in relationship with Abimelech, and they're both blessed for it, and his son lives in the same region. So the consequences are better than they were with Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
So there is progress, but it's not perfection yet with Abraham. So that's important. And here's my favorite detail, the best for last. How did Abimelech avoid sinning against God?
Well, he definitely repented.
He does, but God says he prevented him.
Mm-hmm.
God actually goes before Abimelech and prevents him from sinning in ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
That is a mercy to Abimelech, and I'm assuming the same was true with Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
That is astounding. Because there are other times in the scriptures where it will say God was looking for an occasion against a king, so he allows him to sin. But Abimelech and Pharaoh do this unawares, and God values that by protecting them from their own bad decision. That, to me, is a grace to these two kings that shouldn't be overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
And it tells us something about God.
Yeah. Well, if he wipes out every nation that wipes out every nation that I mean, especially if he wiped out Egypt, then there would have been nothing there but a pothole for future. But obviously there's more to it than that.
Right.
That I think is worth noting.
And it makes this distinction that is consistent throughout the whole rest of the scriptures between intentionally sinning against God in rebellion and unintentionally doing it. Once the law of Moses comes, a sacrificial system is set up to cover unintentional offenses, the very kind of offenses we see demonstrated in Pharaoh and Abimelech. But when it's rebellious, what the Hebrew calls, like in Numbers 15, the sin of the raised right hand, there is no sacrifice for that.
Mm-hmm.
And God is willing. He shows great mercy to Abimelech and to Pharaoh. And what's very clear is that they do this unintentionally. They do not realize that these two are married. Now, the question is, Abram is already aware that if they did know, they still might have killed him. But that would have been a different sin. And God treats it differently. Later on, when other kings deliberately try and destroy Israel, God is going to treat that differently. So the distinction is already being drawn out here, that even in the pagan nations, God treats intentionally offending him and unintentionally differently. And in this case, he protects them from sinning against him because they don't know. That, again, it's revealing to us, all these stories reveal to us the character of God.
Right.
And the justice of God, I suspect, has to connect with rebelliousness or not. Not letter of the law, but rebelliousness.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that in Hebrews. We talked about it, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 to 31. If we deliberately keep on sinning after having come to a knowledge of the truth, no sacrifice for sins is left, but only a fearful expectation of judgment and of raging fire prepared in advance for the enemies of God. Again, the emphasis even in Hebrews in the new covenant is the danger of rebelliousness, of deliberately keep on sinning. That distinction between those two kinds of sins are even present here in Genesis. You see it with Cain and Abel. Right. Cain doesn't seem to deliberately bring the wrong sacrifice, but he brings the wrong sacrifice. So God says, I'm not pleased with that, just like he does with Abimelech and Pharaoh. I'm not pleased with what you did. But they don't know what they were supposed to do, so God is merciful. But when the people become deliberately rebellious, well, the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, right? He treats rebelliousness very differently than he does ignorance.
Yeah.
And so we're starting to see who God is already in these stories.
Right. Yeah. Also, the whole concept we're talking about, the commandments too. I mean, it's obvious here, the covetousness of another. I mean, it says specifically another man's wife.
Yeah.
So it's just,
covetousness, theft, adultery. Yep. It's all here.
All here.
Yeah.
Unavoidable. Just pointing out the low fruit, you say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's important to say because we're seeing that these cultures out of which Abraham has come and into which he has migrated they're not godly. They're not Torah observant. Of course, there is no Torah yet, but they're not even accidentally stumbling into right or wrong.
Right. But there is godly direction, though. I mean, this makes it even more clear that
even to pagans, even to people who are not in Abraham's family, God has been interacting. And Genesis is going to make that clear. We're even going to run into a pretty godly king of what eventually would become Jerusalem in the person of Melchizedek.
Yep.
So God, this region is not a place where God has not ever interacted. You and I are given the story of Abraham and the people of Israel as a unique story. But what's unique is not that God talked to them. It's what God said to them that's unique. And what he chose them to do is unique. But God speaks even to pagans. God is the God of the whole earth. Not simply the God of Israel.
So I guess the real hard question is to ask the because there's going to come a time when we're actually going to be faced with a similar problem, not necessarily just with our loved ones, but who do we associate ourselves with? That's ultimately it's Christ. I mean, there's going to come a time where in Revelation we talk about it some more where there's that who's your Lord mentality, and so I think that we'd be amiss to not even mention that. But I think it would be hard. I mean, I don't I don't know too many. I don't know too many men that would do this.
No, I don't think there are too many men who have the ability to do this. But if you want to know what's in a person's heart, give them enough money and resources and power, and then you'll see.
Yeah.
The question is, are most of us, men and women, monogamous because we choose to be, or monogamous because we have to be? And most of us are curtailed by our finances, our opportunities, our intelligence, our charisma. We are restrained, somewhat constrained. But what happens if a person has opportunity? What will they do then? And that is the question. And so that's what I meant when I said what you see in a king is what is often present in everybody, but only the king can exercise it. Because the king operates with power, influence, authority, things that the average person doesn't have. So we are striving to be, as followers of Jesus, people who are not simply, our base behaviors are not simply curtailed by our environment, but actually by our hearts. And that is, that's miraculous. Only God can do that. Most of us, our bad behavior is held in check by our environment.
Yeah.
We can't afford to be as bad as we want to be. But kings can. And wealthy people can. So a wealthy, virtuous person is a rarity, not because wealth makes people evil, but because people are evil and wealth releases it. Mm-hmm. So sometimes we'll say it's hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says that. Well, why is it hard for a rich person? And most people want to do the pious thing. Well, because they put their faith in wealth. No, it's because wealth doesn't provide any restraints. Like most people are better than they deserve to be because they don't have opportunity to be as bad as they could be. But wealthy people don't have those restraints. And once you give into the flesh the way a wealthy person can, it's very difficult to get yourself back. So wealth provides it's kind of the way people raise their kids today. When you're raised in a world with no boundaries, no guidelines, no rules, you're not going to like what happens. And wealth can provide too much space to roam. You and I will never fully appreciate the blessing of poverty, the blessing of limited resources, because it helps us to be way better than we would normally be. So that's what I'm kind of getting at with, you have to look at the king to know what the people are really like. So who's our king? Jesus. And he has unlimited resources. And how did he choose to live? Now that's a good person. He could have done anything and no one could have stopped him. And look at who he is. So if we want to be part of his kingdom, we're going to have to be people who choose to be good, are not simply forced to be good. And that's the difference in Jesus' kingdom. I mean, can you imagine? Minister Joe, he has all the power in the world, all the resources in the world. No judge stands above him. Nobody can criticize him. Nobody can tell him he's wrong. He could do anything he wants. And what does he do? Lives a life of poverty and dies. That's what that God did. That's not what Abimelech would do. I tell you that. It's not what Pharaoh would do. It's not even what the president of the United States would do.
That's right.
We serve an entirely different kind of king. Mm-hmm. And he asks us to be a different kind of citizen, a citizen that doesn't need law to be godly, that doesn't need police to do what's right. It's impossible, right?
Truly above the law.
Never pray for your children to be rich.
Right, yeah. Oh.
No worse curse could be put on a human than wealth. Because with wealth comes too much opportunity. And you and I both met very godly people who have wealth, but they are a rarity. And when you meet them, God did some work before they got this wealth.
Mm-hmm.
It's dangerous. And so Abimelech, Pharaoh, these are the highest positions of power. The way they behave is unrestrained. as unrestrained as the culture would allow. And so they show us what's in our hearts, just like every king of Israel shows what's in the hearts of the people. And even today, our leaders show who we are. We don't like it. We like to distance ourselves, but we participate in the culture that produced them. And if this culture didn't allow them to be that way, they wouldn't be that way. People are as the culture permits. And so they are always mirrors on us. Even when we hate them, we made it. I had a friend. We would drive. He's just kind of a silly guy in high school. This was junior high. He used to do this every time we go on a bus trip. I grew up in Uxbridge, Massachusetts. My school was in Whitensville, Massachusetts. Every time we went on a bus trip, we went by a sewage treatment plant, and it stunk. And every time we drove by, this one friend of mine, he knows who he is, would yell out, "I contributed to that." If you don't like your leaders,
right.
You contributed to that. People can't be other than their society will allow. They cannot be other than their society will allow. The limits on a person's character are always societal. And so if you find someone you don't like, blame your society.
Live in the cesspool.
So what I'm encouraging the people to read the story of Abraham and also realize you're learning about humanity. And you and I started the conversation with observing that not much has changed. We're still, cultures change, technology changed, laws change, but the fundamental human urges, impulses, and they don't really change. Look at the Jeffrey Epstein story. It's pretty much Pharaoh. He didn't have to be king. He just had to get $1 billion, but he still behaves the same way. He's virtually a modern day Caligula, who was a Roman emperor who had a taste for doing quite unsavory things. Things don't really change. Hitler's not that different than Nero.
It's pretty powerful to think about sometimes, even sometimes what looks like a curse can be an open door for God to do something quite particular.
Yeah.
I just from experiences that I've been in, sometimes it feels like, you get in a circumstance with a church situation or a difficult situation, but God actually can use, like what it says, what Joseph physically says, what you intended for evil, God made something good out of it.
Yeah, that's the perfect quotation from Genesis, where that gets encapsulated in a wonderful speech, and then picked up again in Romans when it says God works all things to the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. But I'm going to make a caveat. I make it a lot. You know what I'm going to say? God doesn't require us to do evil in order to get good from it.
Right.
He will turn what is evil into good, but that does not imply he needed the evil.
Right.
So we're not saying that God wanted Abraham to lie so that Abimelech could learn. God will harden people's hearts. He'll keep them going in the direction they're already going for his own purposes or to reveal himself to them. But what the book of James insists, and this is true through the scriptures, he's just encapsulating it, is that God does not tempt, nor does he desire people to do evil. Mm-hmm. So we would not blame Abraham's lie on God. Right. But we do recognize that God turns that towards a good. Mm-hmm. And that is what he promises to do.
It also reveals a change in Abram or Abraham's progressive development of faith. I've been walking with the Lord a long time, and I feel like there's times where my faith has grown a lot more than other times, and so I can appreciate that. It doesn't make it that that initial call or that initial development of faith is vital. Commitment.
And let's be honest, Minister Joe, when have we grown the most?
Yeah.
When you leave something familiar and go to completely unfamiliar territory. I often think, remember, there was a kind of a period of time where the millennials got blamed for this, but it wasn't their fault. People were taking out boatloads of debt and then coming out of college and finding they couldn't find a job, so they couldn't even afford an apartment. So they ended up living with their parents. There's really a much bigger story to that, and it's really a societal story. I don't know why the millennials got so harassed for that, but many of them found themselves incapable of supporting themselves coming out of college with $100,000, $150,000 worth of debt and no job. So there's a societal thing going on there. But anyway, as soon as you can leave your parents' home, you're going to find you grow in ways you cannot grow as long as you stay under somebody else's wing. And God often calls us out. And you and I have experienced that, right? Our deepest periods of growth are when we step out into the unknown.
Oh, yeah.
And so for those who are younger, who haven't done this yet, as soon as you can, you're robbing yourself of a journey with God you will never experience if you don't put yourself at risk.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so curse can be a place where we grow. Stepping out in faith is a place where we grow. The point is, until we need God, it's funny we don't need God.
Yeah, just to qualify what you mean by risk, we're not talking stupidity. We're talking.
No, yeah, you can put caveats on what I said too. Yeah, you're not. This is what Satan wanted Jesus to do: jump off the pinnacle of the temple, see if God will catch you. Then you'll know.
Yeah,
you know, that's just stupidity. We're only talking the risk God asks us to take. Well, we should wrap it up. Any final words, Minister Joe?
Well, I just want to encourage you to remember again that Abraham was in the incubator, the faith incubator here, and not that if you've been walking with the Lord for a long time that this doesn't apply to you. These are real life foundational things that we need to hang on to and understand. The idea of being a blessing, the idea of the blessing and curses, even some of the things that people say to their own family members can be blessing and curses that stay with them forever. So remember that we're called to be, if we're children of Abraham, called to be a blessing to all those around us, to the nations and everything. So it's not some kind of ideal or just to give them money. I think there's a lot more involved in that we need to cling to and understand.
Yeah, and I hope we've made it clear enough too, along those lines, maybe just a little bit different. I hope we've made it clear that Abraham, the errors he's making are unseen errors. Like God hasn't yet told him that he shouldn't have said to Pharaoh that Sarah was God didn't tell him that. And you might say, why wouldn't God tell him that? Shouldn't God? But the thing is, God gives us laws we can obey. And that's what he says about the law of Moses, that he gives them a law they could obey. Now, they thought the law was holiness itself, but Jesus reveals it wasn't. Jesus says, I didn't want you to get divorced, but I let you get divorced because you were hard of heart, which means the law did not actually define obedience, like true holiness. It only defined what God was asking of them at the time. So what we have to recognize is that you and I are probably letting God down every single day. But he probably hasn't told us everything he truly expects of us. What we have to be concerned about is what we do with what he does tell us. We can't be concerned about what he hasn't told us. But we're foolish if we think if we obey all the law of Moses and all the teachings of Jesus seamlessly, we would be foolish to think we were holy. Because we've only done what he's asked.
Right.
True holiness, you and I don't even know what it is. Like Abraham here is clearly sinning. Later under the law of Moses, this would be a sin. But he hasn't been told it's wrong, so he doesn't see it. You and I have things like that in our lives right now. No matter how holy we are, we have things that God is disappointed in that we know nothing about. But that's why Jesus died for us. For those things. What we need to be concerned about is our rebellions. The question you ask is not, am I perfect? But what am I doing with what God has told me? And when Jesus says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, I think implied in that is be perfect enough. What perfection is submission, not sinless perfection where we're not doing anything wrong. We don't even know all the wrong things. Any more than Abraham knew all the wrong things. He didn't know all the wrong things he was doing, but he was following God. He was doing what God asked him to do. But there was a lot of stuff he didn't know. Same is true with us. We'll never be perfect. And some of us are not even aware right now of something that a week from now God might tell us that we have to do. But we're only responsible for what he's told us.
Yeah.
And we should never confuse that with true perfection. Because Jesus said only God is good.
My first, when you said that, my first really what stuck in my mind was that's called a relationship when your willingness to go on and develop, because if you knew everything, there wouldn't be any reason to change. It would all be, you had it all, it's all written down in your mind, and you just got to unpack it.
And that is the danger of legalism. What Paul means when he says righteousness could never come by the law, he means that it's not even possible to write down everything that would need to be written down in order to be truly righteous. And if you saw the standard, well, you'd never be able to reach it. But it hasn't been written down because righteousness doesn't come from law, it comes from relationship. We are only responsible to obey what he has told us and to follow where he leads us. But righteousness, that's not it's the faith that makes us righteous, not the law. Because the law it doesn't say it all. But trusting God is what makes us righteous, not because it's fine for us to disobey, but because there's no way to write down. I mean, how could you write down what it looks like to be righteous in every circumstance? The world wouldn't fill the books. Righteousness can't come by law. The only way righteousness can come is by trusting the one who tells you what the right thing is. So it has to be relationship. And Paul leaves room for that as well. He of course, he assumes everybody is supposed to obey the law. That's kind of the lowest standard that can be set. Mm-hmm. But he also says you might be convicted of other things. This is Romans 14, and you should follow your conscience in the Lord. Well, he's indicating that God can tell you things that have never been written down in the law. Of course they can, because righteousness comes by faith in God, not by the law. That doesn't mean you can disobey. I mean, I'm guessing when Jesus looks at like the Ten Commandments, Sermon on the Mount, those kind of laws, he's thinking, yeah, this is like if you're ever going to be holy, you can't drop any lower than this. I mean, any lower than this is a trash heap. I mean, this is pretty much as low as you can go. And we're thinking it's an impossible standard. And I'm thinking, I think it's probably the lowest standard. Like this probably doesn't even approximate what God is and who he is. But it's attainable for us with Jesus' help.
Lots of grace.
Lots of grace. Lots of mercy as we stumble, just like with Abraham. Yeah. So who knew we'd get into all this with Abimelech, Pharaoh, Abraham, right. Sarah. But there's a lot in these stories. So we're moving through the Abraham story unconventionally because we're going to do it in these parallel blocks. So each week we'll be jumping around a bit.
Yeah, I'll keep you guys crazy.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Minister Joe, and thank you, everybody.